the lecture of today's meeting, Professor Pieter Emmer.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I will start with 3 disappointments. First of all, I'm not from a university, but from the Academia Europaea. Every country has a national academy, but there is also an Academy of Europe in which scholars of all European countries participate. In that way, you could say Europe is a success, albeit a small one. Secondly, I'm afraid I have to tell you, I'm not a political scientist. I'm a historian. So, in order to arrive at a good result, I hope you can help me and I can help you to explain why the decolonization of the European colonial empires had in fact very little effect on European societies and European economies. If you look at Europe in 1945 and you look at Europe in 1985, you will see a tremendous growth in spite of the fact that all the colonial empires have disappeared that had been built up in the 400 years before. And the third disappointment is perhaps that I will not talk for an hour and a half, but at most for 45 minutes, if not for 30 minutes, and perhaps that will give you the opportunity to ask some questions. But let's start with the very basics of decolonization. Why did Europe decolonize? There are 3 factors that you should keep in mind. The first factor is that the colonies wanted independence. I will talk about that at some more length later on. The second factor is that the mother countries in Europe, the colonial mother countries, you know them, I think it's not difficult. It's Portugal, it's France, it's Belgium, it's the Netherlands, and it's Great Britain. Then you have, I think, the most important colonial mother countries. There are other countries that have some smaller colonial possessions, but basically these are the major colonial powers. And the third factor that contributed to the rapid decline of the colonial empire are the changes in the international setting after 1945. You could say the major powers after 1945 were no longer situated in Europe, because Europe had destroyed itself, you could say, in 2 world wars. The world powers then were the Soviet Union and America, and both were very anti-colonial, both the United States as well, of course, as the Soviet Union. Now, to come back to the decolonization in the colonies. What would you suggest is a major factor in the colonies that contributed to decolonization? Why did the colonials ask for independence? How did that, what was, you think, different in 1945 compared to 1900, 1800?
Weakness of the European powers? Or the colonial
Yes,
powers?
that's absolutely true. The colonials did actually know about the 2 world wars, did know about the massive killing in Europe, etc. And the feeling was, you're absolutely right, Europe obviously is not that superpower that it used to be. Our colonial mother is in bad trouble. This is the time to get rid of this colonial power far away. That's a good point. Any other suggestion why the colonials wanted independence, and what actually brought them to express that more, what is it, vividly after 1945 than before?
Maybe because of the third thing you mentioned, that both very strong powers were anti-colonial.
Yes,
so
that's absolutely true. In the colonial, there are signs that yes, the idea is about that a country, in order to actually flourish and to grow, you need to be independent. And that, of course, that feeling was strong among the elite, the colonial elite. And secondly, among the colonial elite, there were a growing number of people that adhered to the communist ideology. And both, of course, contributed to a demand for rapid independence. Yep?
Maybe also because the colonized countries felt that the degree of exploitation was rising more and more. For example, the African countries or African population was used as British soldiers. They had to
Absolute
fight
point.
in a European...
Perfect point. Perfect point. The colonial, colonial subjects, as I would like to call them, finally had been around in the world. I mean, France used colonial soldiers, Britain used colonial soldiers all over. A good example is the end of at the end of the Second World War, parts of Rheinland-Pfalz in Germany were liberated by army units headed by Senghor, later to be the president of Senegal, and he actually became one of the main protagonists of independence. It's absolutely right. The idea that the colonials felt that, we've looked at the world, being a colonial subject is not normal. We want to get rid of that status. Okay, I think you've actually mentioned the major factors. I could add, of course, that the colonial elite had grown over time, because after, let's say, 1850, in some colonies after 1900, you get the establishment of universities. Colonial subjects are sent to the mother country to go to secondary school and to university. So the colonial elite was growing and felt that all these positions in the colonies taken by the colonizer, they might as well fill themselves. They would like to be a police president, they would like to be a governor, they would like to be a mayor, etc., etc. Fine. Now we turn to the mother country. What do you think weakened the will of the mother country to continue with the colonial empire?
Well, we are after a war.
Sorry?
We are after a war in 1945, so there is tremendous crisis in the country.
Yeah.
So basically the country is to deal with an internal crisis, an economic crisis on every level, and also with a colony that wants independence.
Absolutely.
And we have to choose.
Yep.
Which is more important, your country or a colony? And choose your country.
Absolutely.
Because if you don't choose your country, then you can be wiped out.
Yep. No, it's absolutely true. A good example is the country where I come from, the Netherlands, more or less partly devastated by the German occupation in 1945. Suddenly, there was a call for Indonesian independence, the major colony of the Dutch, and as you meant, there had to be a choice made. Originally, the choice was made to fight the independence fighters in Indonesia and not to start rebuilding the Netherlands. How that generation of my parents made that choice, I still cannot explain, but they made it. And the feeling was, of course, the same goes for France, that the German occupation actually was a bad interval in between, a period of economic growth. If we return to the period before the war with the same constellation, the same colonial constellation, life will be good again. The exception, of course, is Great Britain. They really realized that there was only one option, to try and develop Britain, and no longer, held on to a colonial empire. And Britain, as you know, was the first country to decolonize, they had experience because they decolonized North America at the end of the 18th century. And then, of course, India and Ireland were, first Ireland and India were next. But you're absolutely right, but in France and in the Netherlands, the feeling was that in 1945 perhaps we should hang on to the colonial empire in order to restore the prosperity that we had before the war. But very soon, of course, you couldn't do the two. I mean, in order to send troops to Indonesia, the Dutch had to buy oil on the international market with dollars, foreign currency that was very scarce. So the Dutch had to postpone drinking coffee because that also had to be bought by foreign currency in order to send troops to Indonesia. Just a small example of what that choice entailed. Good. Okay, now you're a political scientist, so this is an excellent historical answer, but there must be a political answer to why the colonizers were not really willing anymore after 1945 to fight for their empire. Any changes in the... Yeah?
The founding of the United Nations and the rights of some...
Yeah, but that is a more international factor, I would say. It's absolutely true that when the Americans founded or pushed for the establishment of the United Nations as a successor to the League of Nations that had failed in the 1930s, they saw the United Nations, one of the first tasks of the United Nations was to decolonize the world. The United Nations should make a list of all the colonies that were there, and then a timetable to... that didn't go down with the colonial powers very much. I mean, what is it? So Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, said, well, I can't resist the Americans because we need them in the war, but after the war, we'll look again. So you're absolutely right. Now I'm thinking of changes with... Yes?
We have the configuration of the world, the bipolarity between
the communists and the free world.
The communists and the Americans.
And how would that impact?
The European powers, excluding powers, are coming on second or third place. So the fight, the ideological and political fight is between the two blocks.
Yeah.
So,
but how would that impact on the will to keep on colonies? You're almost there, I think. Would you say that the communist parties in all Western European countries have grown after the Second World War because of the fight of the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany? And they, of course, were very anti-colonial, but never did the communist parties become so strong that they could have a majority. So there must be more at stake. What if you move from the extreme left to the more, what party then would come to mind? The Social Democrats. And the Social Democrats, from the 1920s on, were much more skeptical towards the colonial empire than the right-wing and conservative parties. And again, the Social Democrats were an important power in all the colonial mother countries. On the other hand, before I came and prepared this lecture, I thought perhaps I can give you a wonderful idea, a simple idea of how the political constellation was during the decolonization process. I'm afraid I'm at a loss, because the first steps towards decolonization in Great Britain after 1945 were under which government? That was Labour. After Winston Churchill lost and Labour won, Attlee. If you look at my country, the Netherlands, it was a coalition government between the Christian Democrats and the Socialists. If you look at Belgium, the decolonization of the Congo in the beginning of the 1960s, it was a coalition government of the Conservatives and the Liberals. In France and Portugal, sorry? Yeah, in France and Portugal, you needed in fact a regime change, I think you call it, in order to get decolonization going. And the goal in France, which I think is more right-wing, and in Portugal, the Revolução of 1975 is more left-wing. So it's a very confused picture. And that, I think, helps my thesis, which I now plan to develop, is that it looks very impressive on the map to have a colonial empire. When I was a boy, of course, I had a map of the world in my room, and you could clearly see all the pink areas were British, the dark blue areas were French. What is it? I don't know which color the Dutch colonies had, the Portuguese, etc. The world was sort of, for 400 years that colonial empire was constructed, and it is extremely interesting to see that in 40 years it crumbled, it disappeared, nobody wanted to know about it anymore at the end, and that it actually did not, to a great extent, influence European politics, with the exception of the dictatorship in Portugal and perhaps France. It played a role in changes in politics, but actually, if you look at the crisis after the decline of the Soviet Union in Eastern European countries, if you look at the present crisis that we have, you heard about in the previous lectures, the end of empire in Europe is really an event that sort of happened without much of an impact. A tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. That's Shakespeare. Right. Okay. Why was the colonial empire so marginal to European economy and European society? In order to understand that, I think I want to divide the colonial empire into 4 types. And each type I will discuss whether they had, what sort of a link they had with the colonial mother country. The most important colonies that decolonized first were the settlement colonies. Those were the colonies where the overseas population in that colony was reduced to a marginal size. Think of North America, think of Australia, think of New Zealand. And where large numbers of European migrants, immigrated. You could also mention the Spanish colonies in Latin America. They were similar. And the Portuguese in Brazil. Now, I think by thinking about the construction of such colonies, you immediately, I think, understand that it isn't very difficult to decolonize such a settlement colony. Very soon, think of North America, one of the first to, I think the very first to decolonize. Why were they interested in a link with Great Britain? Great Britain dictated trade policies. It was much better for the Americans to have their own trade policy. Some of the government positions were held by people from Britain. The same goes for the Spanish Empire, the Peninsulares, the people from Spain had the governor position, had the viceroy, etc., etc. Why should you, as a colonial subject, pay for it? You're equal to the subjects in Britain. You realize no taxation without representation, and that went for North America, but also actually for the other settlement colonies. So, if you think of it, decolonizing a settlement colony is really very easy. You change the flag, invent a new national anthem, and I think that's basically it. You become an independent nation and participate among the other nations on an equal footing. Any objections?
And the borders?
Sorry?
How about the borders?
Yeah, you usually take the borders as the colonial powers had set them. There are a few exceptions, but basically it is interesting to see that the borders will actually remain. There are hardly any changes. This is really history per short. I mean, there is much more to tell. There was fighting. Yes, there were loyalists in North America who then moved to Canada. Yes, there were loyalists in South America who fought the people, who fought Simon Bolivar, etc., etc. But in general, what is it? Settlement colonies are extremely easy to decolonize, and the impact on the mother country is marginal. Who doesn't agree? I've convinced everyone? Okay. Now, the next type of colony, what I would call the administrative colony or the population colony. Those colonies, were only created in the 19th century, and you must then think of Africa and Asia. These colonies are full of non-Europeans, that is, Africans or Asians. There is a very minute administrative echelon in those colonies, by the English, the French, the Portuguese, you name it. But in general, the colony is full of non-Europeans. Again, I would suggest there is not very much of a link with the mother country. Sure, I think in French colonial Africa, if you buy products from abroad, they tend to be from France. That is right, because other products were excluded and made more expensive. The same goes for the British colonies. But in general, these were colonies that didn't really have much buying power to buy international goods. They basically had consumer markets directed towards their own products. There was not really very much exchange. Investments from the mother country did not go to these population colonies. If the French invested, where did they invest? In Eastern Europe, in North America, and perhaps a little bit in South America after independence, but not in their own African colonies. If Britain invested overseas, where did it invest? In North America, in Australia, New Zealand, yes, in Russia before the communist takeover, in Eastern Europe. They invested in Southern Europe, certainly not in British India, or not in British Africa. And that's it. So I repeat my story unless you have any objections. It wasn't all that difficult to decolonize these population colonies. It only meant that, well, rather than having the administrative elite from the mother country, you gave the positions to the people who had been educated locally or who had gone to the mother country for further education. They came back and they could then take over the administration, the army, the police, the judiciary, you name it. It isn't all that difficult. Agree? No objections. You make it yourself too easy. Was there no fighting then? I mean, I talked about North America, that the British, indeed resisted independence, but forget about that. In the end, of course, that didn't really amount to much. I did already mention that there was also similar fighting in South America at the beginning of the 19th century. I don't want to talk about that, but after 1945, were actually the colonial powers willing to fight in order to keep? Yes?
Portuguese.
Sorry? Portuguese. Why is that? Why would the Portuguese be so strange and resist in Angola, Mozambique you're talking about? The problem in Angola, Mozambique, ladies and gentlemen, is it wasn't a population colony as I defined it. It was a mixed colony. A colony of locals, Africans, plus 1 million European settlers from Portugal, but also from other countries.
You have the same in France and Algeria.
In Algeria, that's why there is a problem. So you could have mentioned Rhodesia, the same thing. Those are the exceptions, and sure enough, that made decolonization very, very difficult. If you really press hard, I would say South Africa is a similar problem. Okay, but for the others, a referendum, a treaty, you change the flag, you invent a new national anthem, somebody, who could speak either good French or good English and had a university education or could read and write, he'll be the president or the prime minister, and that's it. And the Europeans retired without much ado. Yes?
For Congo.
Sorry?
Congo, it was difficult decolonization. So this country became Algeria.
Yeah. Now, it's very good that you object, and I would also mention the Dutch in Indonesia already did that. If you can explain it, I would be very grateful. For the Dutch, I can understand because it was an attempt to recreate the atmosphere and the colonial empire that was there before the war, in spite of the fact that the Social Democrats in Holland, of course the communists in Holland, and that the word of us say, you're trying to achieve something that is of the past. Don't do it, it costs a lot of money, it costs a lot of lives, forget about it. And very soon, because of pressure of the United States, the Dutch gave up. In the Congo, that's a very good point. The Belgians in 1961 should have known better. They should have realized that the end of the colonial empire era was there. why not give in to the demands of the nationalists in Congo? On the other hand, I would argue that the Belgians never fought to retain Belgian colonial rule. If they intervened, they accepted the idea of Belgian independence, but if they intervened, it was only to safeguard their mining interest in Katanga and to safeguard the lives of Belgians living there. I don't think the Belgian Congo looks like it actually defies my theory of, that it's, in actual practice I would scale it down and say the Belgians in 1961 realized they couldn't actually stay there, but they took the wrong decisions in decolonizing.
Yes, but if you read the discourse of the king.
Mm-hmm. Famous, oh, painful, yes. Yes. It's a very conservative king. I mean, he was exceptionally so, and in general, I think the Belgian voters, never ever expressed any second thoughts about the decolonization. So, any other objections? Because I'm learning from you, obviously. Yeah.
Well, like civil war that was
Whereabouts?
in the colonies themselves.
Yes, that could happen. Think of the disastrous civil war in British India after decolonization. Because then the British said, well, we're out. I mean, sorry, that's their problem. And yeah, that's happened. What you can say a lot of bad things about colonialism, of course, but what it did was actually sort of freeze the ethnic situation, the ethnic differences in the colonies. The Pax Britannica, the French, the Belgians, they ruled these colonial empires, cut out the borders, cut out by the colonizer, and some of the differences did not come to the open until after decolonization. It's absolutely true. Yes, but that was not, I'm afraid, a reason for the Europeans to stay longer or to continue being colonial masters.
So if I understand correctly, basically your hypothesis is
Yes.
that the nature of the process of decolonization is, the main factor is the type of the colonial empire.
Yeah, the type of colony. And the colonial empire can consist of various types of colonies. Of course, the British, the largest, has, yes.
So you're not taking into account the political actors in the national countries?
I've thought about that, yeah, and I realized with your education that you would stress that, yes. But as an outsider, as a non-political scientist, my feeling is one of surprise. You have this huge colonial empire. There are very few countries that weren't colonized. It disappeared in 40 years, and I think it did impact somewhat on European politics. And I think I mentioned de Gaulle, I mentioned the end of Salazar in Portugal. But otherwise, the Europeans had other matters to look after, and no, I don't think.
How about the domino effect?
Sorry?
The domino effect.
That is correct. In spite of the fact, obviously, that Britain, for instance, decolonized British India. I've read some reports on the Dutch and Indonesia. Why don't we do the same? No, British India and England is completely different. No, we have a mission to fulfill, the arguments of the colonialists. And the same goes for France, and certainly the same goes for Portugal. I mean, Salazar, once was visited by the French minister of the colonies, asked, we are decolonizing, what about you? And he said, in the next 200 years that will not be possible. Portugal will, be nothing without its colonial empire. It's part of the same thing. So, no, my feeling is that, it's not very useful But again, we can differ. It's not very useful to look at internal European politics, don't tell us much. I think we should look at the actions on the international scene and in the various colonial empires to explain what happened. I think, with a few exceptions, European politics don't really make a difference. Yes?
In order to counter your theory,
Yeah.
and I know you mentioned that we only discussed after 1945,
Yeah.
but you could find some roots in the earlier
Period.
period.
Yeah.
For example, in the areas of Ireland and New Zealand,
Yeah.
which can also substantiate Joseph Anson's work.
Yeah.
However, we would generally prefer that you have to look at internal politics as well. So if you look at Ireland, although it's an earlier period, it's still after a war, and it has its specificities.
Yeah.
And it's a civil war, and it's...
It is part of the Civil War, you're absolutely right. Yes, that's correct.
And many, many other factors.
Okay, let's agree. Let's agree to differ for the moment. We'll come back to it because I have two more colonial types to discuss very briefly, and then I think it is time for objections, questions, and perhaps I should leave this room crying and saying, okay. What is it? An interesting type of colony, the third type that perhaps you haven't thought of, are the plantation colonies. They're interesting because usually the local population is being completely removed. Think of the Caribbean, of course, that's it, but you could also Fiji, Mauritius, La Réunion, those smaller islands where the Europeans actually arrived, the local population disappeared, usually died because of the high mortality after contact with the European after Columbus in the 16th century. And lots of investments from Europe, settlers from Europe, but laborers from Africa and Asia to do the work. A very artificial type, a colony, you could say European made, completely different from the previous two types that I discussed. Is it difficult to decolonize these plantation colonies? Yes, because there is no internal nationalism, there is no cohesion, let's say in the Caribbean, where you have the people who descend from the slaves, people who descend from the contract laborers from Asia. It's a sort of layered society where the layers of society have very little contact. Perhaps the Spanish plantation colonies are a bit of an exception with more nationalism, think of Cuba. But in general, these plantation colonies are not very interesting. And then you see that is there that I would admit it is there that the, mother countries set the pace. Britain wants to always to decolonize, whatever happens. Certainly after the experience in North America and Ireland, and the decolonization of India, and you see that whether the plantation colonies, Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, wanted to decolonize or not, they were decolonized. The French, I think, in general, are against decolonization. They cannot understand the idea that you want to separate from France. That is something that should happen. So, what happened with the French plantation colonies, Guadeloupe, Martinique, Guyana, they were made in the Département d'Outre-mer, and if you go there, it's a part of France. I once had a colleague there that I asked for her address, Madame Dumoulin, Rue de Fort-de-France, Martinique, France. France? Martinique? No, France. Okay. So, the Dutch actually have absolutely no decolonization policy. They have no idea. They were surprised by the independence movement in Indonesia and its success. They were surprised by the pressures of the Americans to decolonize. So what happened with their leftover colonies in the Caribbean? It's a mess. At this very moment, they're still part of the Dutch Empire, the Dutch Kingdom. They have independence. the upshot is that the Dutch will pay the deficits of their budgets. There are 6 tiny islands in the Caribbean, plus what is it? There is one colony on the mainland of South America, Suriname, that in the end has been decolonized because the Dutch felt, that would have been a better solution. But in general, that was a very difficult, thing to achieve. So these plantation colonies are sort of league by themselves. They're not very important, they're not very big, but they constitute a league by themselves. And that also goes for my last and fourth category, and those are the trading establishments. You think of Hong Kong, Macau, Gibraltar, Cyprus, Aden. Those really should not be used in the discussion that perhaps we're going to have after the end of my talk to prove a point, because they really are exceptions. Gibraltar is obvious, doesn't want to be colonized, it wants to remain part of Britain. Britain did not actually want to spend the money on defending Aden, so that's why it's ended. Goa, a Portuguese enclave in India, was conquered by India, I think in the 1960s. And Hong Kong and Macau, I think, were actually restored to China because the lease that they had ended after 100 years. Nobody expected when the lease was signed that this would happen, but and I think if you were to ask the inhabitants of Macau and Hong Kong whether they would have preferred to remain under Portuguese and British auspices, because they would have liked to remain the exceptions in China, the enclaves, rather than become part of China. But, well, there are transition measures taken. So those colonies are not really, something that we should spend a lot of time. Any questions? Yes?
Is it 4 types?
Sorry?
Is it 4 types, but you were talking about mixed types before when you were talking about Belgium, so you do allow some subtypes or mixed types between those?
No, I think we're really talking about completely different scales. I mean, if you talk about the settlement colonies, if you talk about the administrative colonies or population colonies, you're talking really about different things. The plantation colonies are a category by itself. Now I'm talking about just actually city-states, basically, and they're very minute. You should not really confuse these types. But you're not happy with these typology. Okay, we'll come back to that. Let me finish. What is it? What time is it actually? Okay, that will leave some time for questions. A few last remarks. I think I repeat, if you can help me with suggesting what the political makeup of the mother country should be in order to have the conditions most favorable to decolonization, I would be very grateful. I don't see them. What is it, as I mentioned, the political situation is different in Great Britain, different from the one in the Netherlands, different from the one in Belgium, different from the one in Portugal and in France. Obviously, again, there is no clear-cut idea that only when the Social Democrats are in power, decolonization will take place. Only when the right-wing groups are in power, it will happen. Obviously, that isn't the case. Many people, of course, argue that decolonization is just a veil, something that really hasn't changed the situation in the world, and there is much to be said for that. That is true. At this very moment, there are more development workers working overseas than there were ever colonial civil servants. That's for sure. But in general, I think we've really ended a phase in history by decolonization. The interesting thing is, of course, for those who feel that the colonies and colonial empires were of extreme economic importance to the mother country, I think for those people who believe that, I think it is very good to remember that the economies of Western Europe after decolonization started on a growth path never equaled before in history, which again perhaps shows that having a colonial empire is certainly not always a benefit. And again, would a continued decolonization have made the world very different? I think at the very beginning of my talk, one of you mentioned the rising expectations. And I think that's what ended colonialism after 1945. Before that period, people in the mother countries could live with the idea that the colonial world was different, that there were fewer doctors, that there were fewer railways, that there was less potable water, etc., etc. After 1945, increasingly in the 1950s and 60s, the idea was that couldn't last. If we have a colonial empire, the same rules that we apply at home, the same should apply in the colonies. And of course, that was impossible to achieve for the colonial countries. And vice versa, the intermediaries in the colonies, realized that, continued colonialism, was impossible. The expectations of the colonial subjects were such that the colonial powers couldn't meet them, and that meant that, the colonial, link should be severe. That is my, talk about the impact of decolonization on Europe after 1945. And again, I hope you beg to differ, and I would like to hear your comments. Yes?
I will have one comment. When we were talking about the Portuguese colonies, you suggested that the reason why you believe that Portuguese were willing to fight in this war, that there is some kind of mixed colony in this
population and settlement, right?
Population and settlement. I think that there is another factor that is at least should be considered. And that is that, Portuguese Estado Novo, it was a para-fascist regime, strongly rightist, extremely rightist. And this decolonization movement in these colonies was strongly influenced, armed and trained, financed by Soviets. That's actually why they had support, Portuguese in this colonial war, at least from the beginning. From the Western Europe and United States. So I think that this factor should be also considered when talking especially about Portuguese.
No, that is a point. I did mention at the beginning of my lecture that you had changes in the mother country, changes in the colony, but also changes in the intellectual spectrum. And obviously you're right that the anti-colonial power par excellence, the United States, changed this attitude slowly and gave preference to fighting communism worldwide, and that meant not supporting nationalists in Angola, Mozambique, but helping the Portuguese government. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Any other observation, question? Yes.
Thank you for your lecture. First of all, two puzzling.
Yes.
Things I want to clarify. Referring first of all to the case of Panama, and how do you reconcile the case of Panama with America's anti-colonial perspective? And second of all, how would the countries of the future countries of the Middle East, Syria, would fit into your scheme? Countries that were after the First World War
part of an influence sphere, yeah. Well, if you talk about decolonization within 45 minutes, you have to have. But you're absolutely right. Panama, of course, seems to define my feeling that the United States was anti-colonial. That also goes for the occupation of Haiti by the United States. It also goes for the Philippines. It also goes for Cuba. Yeah. On the other hand, if you look at the literature on American colonization, First of all, it's never called that way, but that's just words. Secondly, you always have the feeling that the Americans don't really want to be colonizers. They temporarily do something and then somehow, by muddling through. Now, I think the Panama Canal is absolutely an exception. Of course, they wanted this strategic, canal to be part of the United States, is not to avoid the problems with the Suez Canal that happened. So, yes, it was leased, I think, also from Panama in a certain way, and in that way, the United States should have been ashamed of itself to define its own policy. You're absolutely right. Yes, but I would still argue it's an exception there. Yeah.
If you said you believe in the decolonization today, so how would you explain, I don't know, the example of the intervention of France in Mali from historical point of view, employment of this moral obligation?
You realize there's a big debate on this in France at the moment, and what is it? The right-wing parties under Sarkozy, actually this is a stupid move, we shouldn't do this, but you're absolutely right. France, in intervening in Francophone Africa, which it is, still seems not to realize that, it's over. The excuse is, of course, to defend, French interests in the region, which are really marginal. And I'm surprised to see the French taxpayers go along with a very expensive operation that hardly serves France's national interest. And at this very moment, I think there are steps taken to replace the French army by an international army. But you're absolutely right. Yeah. Okay.
I've got a question on the effect or on the impact now on European politics.
Do you see effect?
I would say I see one, and I want to confirm whether you would say it's the same. Could we say that the process of decolonization triggered a deeper integration, or the will to integrate or to form a European Union because of the loss of these economic markets?
Yeah, well, we should actually look at the people who spoke this morning and ask them their opinion. But I think you're on to something very different. If I just speak for my own country, the Netherlands, the feeling was, of course, the Netherlands might have been a very small country in Europe. We were a world power with Indonesia, a country with 70 million people at the time, many times the size of Holland, etc., etc., etc. Once that was disappeared, taken away by the Americans or whatever the Dutch thought about this decolonization, the feeling was we have now finally become a European power. We should no longer be neutral. We're not anymore. We're not in the position of Switzerland. We're no longer. We should join the European Defense League and later on NATO. We should become we should interest ourselves in the United Nations, a new organization. And indeed, we are one of the founding members. The Dutch are one of the founding members of the European Union. Yes, it's absolutely true. That did help the idea of integrating Europe by getting rid of all the sort of excess territory outside of Europe. Perfect point. Excellent.
So it was to compensate the loss of power.
Yeah, indirect you could say it did certainly do stimulate change. There are more questions than I can answer perhaps. Yes, go ahead.
I would beg to differ. I think that I want to ask you, the colonization process and decolonization, not the process but the words, are still present in the political discourse. Because what do you think of the guilt mechanism? The international community and the European community and in European politics, we have this guilt mechanism, as in if something goes wrong in a country in Africa, let's say Sudan, you turn to the former mother country, and it starts like this. It was your colony. Sorry, it was your colony. What did you do then? And usually in peace talks, if there's civil unrest or other wars, the former mother country.
I've thought about that, and I'm afraid the guilt complex also extends to the countries in Europe that had no colony. There are similar feelings in Germany, there are similar feelings in Switzerland, there are similar feelings, but we are rich, they are poor, somehow that is connected, we have a guilt. Now, is there an extra guilt for those who had a colonial empire? Yes, in the Netherlands there certainly is a feeling that if something goes wrong in Indonesia, until recently the feeling was perhaps that might have been the result of Dutch colonialism. I don't know what you feel. Is there somebody from Britain here? I think in Britain that feeling is almost absent. Perhaps that empire was too large in order to to make a specific case. So it's mixed. I would say there is a general guilt feeling in the rich world. Towards the poor world? Based on the fact that colonialism might have been one of the factors of underdevelopment. You're absolutely right. But whether you could pinpoint specific cases to the previous colonizer, I don't know.
But can we agree that there are political pressures?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and it's particularly some of the politicians of these ex-colonies will play this out. It's absolutely true. Yep.
I will add at the topic of Great Britain.
Yeah.
For example, Indians that are settling in Great Britain, they have a lot of social benefits. They receive houses if they get married and they have a child. So they receive the citizenship easier.
And you would argue that is because of the colonial past. If you were Chinese, you wouldn't have the same status.
Not really. Indian people have certain benefits there.
Anybody from South, I mean, it would also apply to Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, because it was one colonial. Yeah. On the other hand, of course, Britain was one of the first countries to scrap the rule that people from the former colonies could immigrate without a visa to Great Britain. So on paper you're wrong, but perhaps in actual practice it might be true that people from former colonies still are preferred immigrants in compared to other immigrants.
It happens because English people are very English.
Well, yes, and of course these people speak English. That also helps. Yes. You're going to finish me off, yes?
Would you agree that the major promoter of the decolonialization process was the United States? So then there should be some motive behind this policy, shouldn't it? It could be the motive perhaps to stay with that way to gain more free space for their own development by reducing the power of the European colonization powers.
Well, somebody who knows more about the United States than I do should actually comment on what my feeling is that the United States felt we are the first colony that separated from the mother country. Look at our economic and democratic development. It's tremendous. Obviously, in order to achieve the same thing, you cannot be a colony. I think that was the basic theory behind the US drive towards decolonization. And as I mentioned, the United Nations was set up in order to decolonize the world. There was a timetable set up, and the United Nations should. There was actually a plan pushed by the United Nations, by the United States, that the United Nations would temporarily take over all the colonies from every colonial power and then start to decolonize them, that there should not be a straight decolonization from the mother country. I think, as I mentioned, in answering a previous question, that attitude in the course of the 1950s, perhaps even at the end of the 1940s, changed because of the fight against world communism. But in principle, the United States wanted a non-colonial world.
But now there's more and more also talking about new colonial.
Yeah.
That's decolonization done by other sort of methods.
I leave that to the political scientists. Any other question? Yeah.
It's kind of more general. Do you think that the colonization process was always a good thing? I mean, I'm talking about Pakistan and India, for instance, created two nuclear powers that are able to handle the world itself. I mean, and don't you think that Britain has some kind of contemporary responsibilities on the India matters? No, because I am against what is called third worldism, you know, and this sense of victimization that in Europe we usually. I mean, I think that also colonies themselves have their kind of crimes.
Oh, sure. No. I mean, there are advantages, disadvantages. I think we agree about the fact that colonialism is something that doesn't fit into the second half of the 20th century. It's with a few exceptions. Good. Now, your question is, and I really can't answer that, whether Britain, after the end of empire in South Asia, really continued to influence. Obviously, they had more power than any other power in the world, perhaps with the exception of the United States and perhaps the Soviet Union, who also perhaps was interested in influencing politics in India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. But I cannot actually say at what stage the colonial past of Great Britain gave that country a sort of special position in this power play after 1948. I'm sorry. Any other observations? Yes, perhaps the last one?
Sure. Just any words on, because you mentioned a lot how it affected
You're disappointed in the title.
A little bit.
Yes.
But can you say some words of how it affected or impacted European integration?
Well, the question was just asked that once Europe shed its colonial empire, it became obvious that there was more room towards integration. Having your own colony made you very different from the other colonial power or from the other European power next door, and that situation changed. We're all in the same boat, more or less. Okay, well, I talked actually longer than I should have, but there were so many questions, so many observations. I'll think of all of them, and forgive me if I've been too simple and perhaps warped the past a little bit in order to make it fit my theory, but thank you for your attention.
Okay, if there are any other questions to Professor Sigmar Schmidt or to Professor Zesselmayer, you have the opportunity to